And I do not see any way that over the course of the rest of this year and 2025 that we can provide the Ukrainians with enough weaponry and they can raise enough troops to hold the line. In other words, we're talking about a defensive mission here, not an offensive mission. I don't think that's possible to do. I think the balance of power has already shifted decisively in the Russians' favor. And if you look at what the situation is moving forward, the balance is going to shift further in the Russians' favor. So the Ukrainians are doomed even in a purely defensive mode. But if you talk about going on the offensive, I mean, they tried this in the summer of 2023 when they were in much better shape in terms of the balance of power than they are today or will be next year. And you know what happened in 2023. They got cut to doll rags. The offensive or counteroffensive, whatever you want to call it, was a colossal failure. So there is no hope of the Ukrainians recapturing lost territory. And as I said, I don't think there's any chance of them even remaining on the defensive and being able to put up a good fight for the foreseeable future. They're also greatly outnumbered in terms of manpower, in addition to all of the categories of weapons. And, you know, you read some stories coming from the Ukrainian side that say that in terms of manpower at a number of critical locations along the front, they're outnumbered 8-1. And in terms of artillery, they're outnumbered 10-1. I've seen 2 or 3 references to these ratios. This is stunning. The Ukrainians are saying they're outnumbered in terms of manpower 8-1. Wow. Artillery 10-1. Remember, artillery is responsible for roughly 80+% of the casualties in this war. And if the other side, we're talking about looking at this situation from Ukraine's perspective, if the other side has a 10-1 advantage in artillery and you're outnumbered 8-1 in terms of manpower, you're finished. It's
a fatal ratio.
I mean,
yeah.
You know, it doesn't matter what we do at this point in time or what the Ukrainians do. The ratios here, the manpower ratios, the ratios in weaponry on the ground. And we didn't even talk about air power, right? The Ukrainians have virtually no air power, and the Russians have a lot of air power and a lot of missiles. And they're wrecking, you know, the energy infrastructure inside of Ukraine, which is going to have devastating consequences now that the winter is coming. So anybody can be telling a story, as Ambassador Taylor is trying to do, about how Ukraine can rescue the situation, I think is living in a dream world.
Okay, and speaking of living in a dream world, it's one thing for a former ambassador to say something on television, but it's a different thing when it's the Secretary of State at the United Nations Security Council.
One of the Council's primary responsibilities is seeking to peacefully resolve conflicts. As President Zelensky has said, no one wants peace more than Ukraine. The United States also wants to end this conflict. And before Putin launched his full invasion, we used every tool we could to try to prevent it, including right here at the Security Council. But the way the Council seeks to end this conflict matters. The UN Charter is crystal clear on this point. When fulfilling its responsibilities, the Security Council, and I quote, shall act in accordance with the purpose and principles of the United Nations, end quote. In other words, we must seek a peace that upholds rather than undermines the UN's core tenets.
We used every tool diplomatically to prevent this war from starting. Did we really?
No, the exact opposite is the case. We basically provoked this war. The Russians were desperate to avoid a war. All you have to do is go back and look at the December 17, 2021 letter that Putin sent to both Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, and to President Biden, suggesting a deal and talking about getting together to figure out how to shut this conflict down and avoid a war. And we basically, in fact, it was Tony Blinken, gave the Russians the high sign. We told them we're not interested. And we continued to push and push and push. And then when the Russians invaded on February 24th, 2022, the Russians immediately thereafter sent a signal to the Ukrainians that they wanted to start peace negotiations. They wanted to end the war. This is right after they started it. Why? Because the Russians had no interest in a war. And the peace negotiations were moving along quite well. There was no final agreement for sure, and one can never be certain that an agreement would have been worked out. But they were making major progress for sure throughout March and early April. And lo and behold, the United States and the British basically tell the Ukrainians that they should walk away from the negotiations and we should continue the fight. That's how the United States has acted. The idea that we tried to prevent this war and then we tried to shut it down and produce peace once it started is, again, not a serious argument.